All right, hey everyone. So what I want to look at here is I want to show you some interesting comparative anatomy between a human brain and a sheep brain, right? And then I'm going to relate these, and we're going to talk about these in relation to some skeletal structures as well, some skeletal features. So if we look here, and if you've watched some of the previous sheep brain dissection videos, you'll be familiar with some of the anatomical regions and structures and layout of our sheep brain. And so just looking here initially, right, we're just looking at our two brains, you'll notice that they look pretty similar, okay? They're not exactly the same, but they're similar, right? You have the same lobes, so you have a frontal, you have a parietal, on the other side you'd have a temporal, and then an occipital lobe. You have the same thing here, right? You have a frontal, parietal, occipital, and then again, if we flipped it over, you'd have your temporal lobe here, right? So they're largely the same, but they're not exactly the same, right? You see a cerebellum, right? Cerebellum. You see a thalamus and diencephalon. You see the same thing here. Largely the same thing, right? A large corpus callosum, a corpus callosum on this other side, the other brain. You see a lot of the same things. Now, if you're looking carefully, you may see a difference in the brainstem and then continuing onto the spinal cord, right? And if you see that, you're starting to see one of the main structural differences between a human brain and not just a sheep brain, but any other brain that belongs to an animal that is a quadruped, right? Meaning it walks on 4 legs as opposed to us being able to walk on 2, right? And so that main difference is the orientation of the spinal cord and brainstem relative to the rest of the brain, right? So if we look here, we'll first look at the sheep brain, right? So if we look here at our sheep brain, you'll notice that here's the kind of lengthwise orientation of our sheep brain, right? It's kind of mostly oriented like this, right? And then the brainstem and the spinal cord are running largely in the same direction, right? So meaning it's more parallel to the orientation of the brain, right? It's kind of coming out here, coming out the back. Here's our midbrain, here's our pons, our medulla, and our spinal cord. It's roughly running in that horizontal plane, right? Roughly, and it goes out the back of the skull, right? Now, if we look at our human brain, we'll see that it's largely perpendicular to the orientation of the brain, right? So maybe here's the plane of our cerebrum, right? But then our brainstem and spinal cord is now oriented vertically, right? More perpendicular to the brain, right? Whereas the sheep brain, it's coming out the posterior side, right? It's all more horizontally oriented. Here, with our human brain, it is oriented more vertically, and it's coming out more the ventral surface, right? It's coming out more so the bottom side of the brain as opposed to coming out the back of the brain, right? So instead of coming out this way, it comes out like this, right? And so I already alluded to this, I already mentioned it, but this is largely a reflection of our locomotion, right? How did these two animals, right? Humans, we're animals. How do we move around compared to, say, a sheep or any other 4-legged animal, right? Maybe another mammal in this case, right? So if we look at our human first, right? So let me move this out of the way and let me show you our human brain, right? So picture this, right? Particularly pay attention to where the brain is and the brainstem is in relation to the brain, right? Remember, it's coming out more the ventral surface, coming out underside, more vertically oriented, right? You can relate that then to the skull, right? So here is our skull, and let me zoom out just a little bit so you can see this a little bit more easily. Here's our human skull, right? So here's the anterior, posterior, superior, inferior, lateral, right? So here we have our human skull, right? Now, remember, as I said, we have our human brain, right? And remember, the brainstem and spinal cord is coming out more so on the underside of the brain, right? Which is anatomically, this is the ventral surface of the brain. This is dorsal, this is ventral down here, right? And so you would expect to see the opening for the spinal cord and brainstem. You would expect to see that also on the ventral surface of the skull. And lo and behold, when we look at the ventral surface of the human skull, you see that, right? We see our large foramen magnum, right? Foramen magnum meaning large hole, right? And this is the large opening for that very structure, right? It's that large opening for the brainstem and the spinal cord to exit the skull, right? So it has to exit on the underside. And the reason for this, again, is the way in which we walk, right? The way in which we move. We walk on two legs. So our spinal cord is within our vertebral canal, right? As is any other four-legged animal. But in this case, our vertebral canal and spinal cord is, again, it's oriented more vertically, right? So just think of a human standing up, right? It's more vertically oriented as opposed to, say, maybe your dog or your cat or a horse. Whenever you pet the back of a dog, you pet the back of a cat or a horse or any other, four-legged animal, where you're petting along its back, that's the plane that its spinal cord and vertebral column is running, right? It's in that horizontal plane as opposed to humans, which is more vertical, right? And so our foramen magnum that allows that brainstem and spinal cord to exit reflects that position, and again, that's a reflection of how we walk, right? So keep that in mind. Okay, I'm going to set this off to the side. I'm going to bring back in the sheep brain, right? So again, remember, here's our sheep brain, right? Brainstem, spinal cord, more horizontally oriented. So if we look at the skull of an animal that is a quadruped, right? It's walking on four legs as opposed to two. You would expect to see an equivalent thing, right? You would expect to see the foramen magnum more so at the posterior side of the brain, of the skull, as opposed to the underside ventral surface, right? And so here we have an animal skull, right? So look at this for a second. What do you think this is, right? So again, we already said this is a sheep brain. I'll give you a hint. This is not a sheep. Okay, so this is a sheep brain, but this is not a sheep skull. But for our purposes, it'll work just fine. So look at this for a second. Maybe look at the teeth, right? Look at the teeth. This is a gray fox, okay? So this is a carnivore, right? Notice these large canines here on the end, right? These nice large canines. So here, this is a gray fox, right? So again, fox, it's in the Felidae family. It's walking on four legs, right? If you've ever seen a fox, or you could apply this to your domestic cat, it's walking on four legs, right? And so where you would find its foramen magnum is in a different spot than where you'd find the foramen magnum on our human skull, right? And so if we turn this over, right, if we look on the underside, we don't see that skull, or I'm sorry, we don't see that opening, right? In the human skull, we found it here, but if we look more at the posterior surface, now we see that large opening, right? This is our foramen magnum here, right? And so that foramen magnum is oriented more so at the posterior side of the skull. And again, that would help accommodate a more horizontally oriented brainstem and spinal cord coming out the backside of an animal that walks on four legs as opposed to two, right? And so again, this is a sheep brain, this is a fox skull, so the brain and skull don't match, but the comparison and the assessment of how the brain and spinal cord is oriented compared to the foramen magnum, that still holds true, right? And so this is useful, not just in looking at the differences between, bipedal animals like humans and quadrupedal animals like sheep and fox and dogs and cats and horses and whatnot, but it's also helpful when looking at, or in the context of research. So maybe an anthropologist or other field researcher, whenever they come across fossils, right? If they come across a fossil of an ancient animal, a hominid, something like that, they can tell whether or not that individual, that animal, likely walked on two legs or walked on four, based on several things. But one thing is the position of that foramen magnum, right? All animals have a spinal cord, and so, or not necessarily, but all the animals that we're concerned with here, so all of our mammals, right, if we're talking about in that context, they have a spinal cord with this foramen magnum. And so based on the position of this foramen magnum, you can have a very well-educated guess as to whether or not that animal walked on 2 legs or 4 legs, right? And so a good example of this is in the human fossil record, right? In the human fossil lineage, a famous fossil called Lucy, whose scientific name is Australopithecus afarensis. But it was a ancient hominid, a human ancestor, and this individual, it was a female, and there have been more fossils found that belong to the same species as Lucy, but Lucy as an individual showed a nice kind of blending, or what you'll hear as transition, between being quadrupedal, right, so walking on 4 legs, to being completely bipedal, walking on 2 legs. And so what you see is you begin to see this foramen magnum. You begin to see it migrate from the posterior side of the skull, and you begin to see it migrating on the underside of the skull, right? And so this then gets into other discussions of types of bipedalism, so what are called habitual bipeds or obligate bipeds. So meaning, do you walk on 2 legs out of habit, or do you walk on 2 legs because you have to? So like humans, we are obligate bipeds, right? We have to walk on 2 legs. We don't walk around on 4 legs, right? But other animals and others in the hominid family, ape line may be some form of what's called a habitual biped, okay, which is beyond the scope of this course. We're not going to talk about it any further. But that's just a little bit of comparative anatomy, and then it also has some kind of some evolutionary implications whenever you're looking at things like the fossil record, right? So reach out if you have any questions about this, and I will see you in the next video.